Queensbury Tunnel is a liability. It serves no purpose, bits of it are falling down, maintaining it involves pouring public money into a black hole, and it presents a threat to members of the public. The best thing we can do is fill it in and forget all about it. But Queensbury Tunnel is also an opportunity. If you wanted to cycle from Bradford to Halifax with a Michelin remoulded midriff like mine, the easiest way to get there would be through this tunnel. People would come here just for that experience, and in doing so, they would benefit the district economically. And Queensbury Tunnel is also a miracle. When a newspaper reporter walked through here in 1878 as construction drew to a close, he declared that the pyramids of Egypt sink into insignificance compared with such a work. Journalistic hyperbole perhaps, but he must have seen something spectacular here to reach that extravagant conclusion. That newspaper reporter wrote two stories about Queensbury Tunnel. One described the goings-on inside, which I can't currently do without diving gear. The other involved a walk over the hill from the South Portal visiting the shafts. And that's the journey I'm going to take, accompanied by Jan Rapach, who knows more than most about the history of the Queensbury lines, having spent many years researching them for his book, or books, I should say.
Indeed, research is an ongoing task.
So what's the appeal of the Queensbury lines then? What makes them stand out above any other bit of railway?
Well, I'm originally from Bradford, and the railway actually passed very close to where I used to live at Great Horton. And the thing that's always fascinated me about these lines is the engineering that's gone into building a line through countryside that really doesn't have an ounce of flat ground anywhere between Bradford, Halifax and Keighley.
Yes, this is not East Anglia, is it? There's nothing level about the ground around here.
There's absolutely nothing flat. It's all uphill, down dale, and I think it's just the grandiose and the Herculean efforts expended by the people who built this line that really sort of fascinates me. If we wind the clock back probably to the early 1800s, there was a number of local industries that had been set up, and it's those mill owners, those industrialists that really started this whole thing about getting a railway through the landscape here. There was a number of schemes. Probably the earliest I've come across was about 1838, and I think at that stage they decided that this landscape was actually insurmountable. They couldn't possibly get a railway through it, but in the end, we ended up with a couple of schemes. So we had the Bradford and Thornton, the Halifax and Ovenden coming up this way, and then the railway company that was involved, the Great Northern, decided that they could link these schemes up and promoted something called the Halifax, Thornton and Keighley Railway. So this was going to take us through this hillside and provide a north and south route.
Casual observer will notice the great beds of shale and bedded sandstone are bent into folds like paper, and in some instances the rocks are so tilted from the ordinary level that the outcrop points to the morning sun, thus reminding one of the great forces of nature that have been at work in ages gone by. Sadly, there isn't much of the approach cutting left, but before we talk about the tunnel, we really ought to mention just how significant this cutting was.
Yeah, indeed, Graham. You can only see a small portion here. The other bit that we've seen at the tunnel is very flooded. It is quite a significant undertaking because it's about 1,000 yards. It's probably about 50 to 60 feet deep, and that had to be driven through solid rock. And effectively, it more or less starts at the end of the Halifax and Ovenden, which was open to goods probably just at this time that the construction was happening here. This was done piecemeal in stages. The major activity was to make a start on the tunnel, and the cutting was cut as they progressed with that. They did have an issue with water. We talked about water here. We've got Strines Beck behind us crossing the aqueduct. That was an early construction on this section to take the water away from the cutting here. They had innumerable problems with drainage and water as part of the railway works.
As we near the tunnel, a large number of men are found with long iron rods or drills in their hands, and they're engaged in making deep holes in the solid rock in which dynamite is inserted. A large number of these holes are drilled in one day, and in the evening they are all fired, going off like the booming of cannon, and can be sometimes heard even at Halifax. When we think about engineering today, we think about big yellow machines and technology and lots of mechanical advantages. They didn't have any of that here.
No, absolutely not. I think this was one of those undertakings that was probably 95% done manually. Manual labour, picks, shovels, it would be iron bars to drill holes in the rock which they would then fill with dynamite. Some steam locomotives with wagons to take the spoil out, and we can see that we're surrounded by the spoil heap, both from the cutting at this point and also from the tunnel itself.
The 1870s was a time when steam navvies were just beginning to make their presence felt. Would they have been of use in this kind of environment?
No, I doubt it, because of just the nature of the ground. It's not very easy going here. We've got solid rock, both the millstone grit and the shale. The steam equipment that was used was probably mostly in terms of lifting, so lifting heavy blocks of stone out of the cutting.
So even the geology made the work of the engineers here that much more difficult.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we just have to marvel at how they managed to do it.
The tramway up the hill connecting the mouth of the shafts with the line below has been taken up, and all the tackling at number 1 and 2 shafts has been removed. This tramway, by an arrangement with the contractors, was made use of by an enterprising coal merchant at Queensbury, who had wagons of coal brought from Homefield Station up the side of the hill to a siding on the top, near the village of Queensbury, this saving cartage from Homefield. It's difficult to imagine, Jan, then, that there was, once upon a time, a railway going over the hill.
There was indeed, Graham. In fact, we had a railway over the hill before we had the railway through the hill. And the reason for that is because the contractors had to get their materials to the different shaft locations in order to start the tunnel. So the first thing they did was to build a tramway, a temporary railway from the Halifax and Ovenden, the end of the Halifax and Ovenden at Homefield, over the hillside to the other side.
How then do you get wagons full of materials up what is a 1 in 3 incline?
That's a very good question. Well, if we think of what went on at each of the shaft locations, there was a portable steam engine at each shaft, which was used to wind men and materials down the shaft of the tunnel and back up again. And these portable steam engines also haul the wagons up on cables up to each shaft location, and then the next one would take over and so on over the top of the hill.
We're standing here at shaft 1. While we're here, we ought to doff our caps to Richard Sutcliffe, a 30-year-old sinker who was struck on the head and killed when a cage broke free from its rope and fell down the shaft. Also, Sutcliffe Hodgson, 27-year-old man who tripped and fell down the shaft. That was in September 1875. Dangerous is a word that gets bandied around now by health and safety people all the time. Tunnelling was genuinely dangerous. It was a matter of life and death.
It was absolutely, Graham, and there was no idea of risk assessments, personal protection equipment or anything else like that. This was a real dangerous environment to be working in. You really had to watch your footing. There were some rudimentary safety elements. For instance, the shaft would have had a cover that would have slid over the top when it wasn't in use, but otherwise it was really a case of watch out, you're going to risk your life here working on the railway.
It's worth making the point also, it's March, it's a nice day, it's a bit windy, but this is going to be a pretty grim place to be working in December, January time in howling gales and horizontal rain.
It is. I think we've got a perfectly marvellous day, probably one of about 2 days in the West Riding like this. Otherwise it's going to be bleak, inhospitable, rain, horizontal, sleet over the winter time. Really a difficult environment to be working in.
We had not proceeded far when there was a noise as of many waters. All at once it seemed to rain in buckets full, and the candle had a narrow escape of being extinguished. The fact was, we were passing number 2 shaft, at which the pent-up waters seemed to be making their escape. It's not so much pent-up waters as howling gale having made our way some distance up the hill. We're at shaft number 2. It says, considerable difficulty was also encountered from the influx of water and black damp from the workings of an old coal pit.
Yeah, I think with water, we've talked about the challenges that the navvies and the contractors had with water. I mean, if you think that we've actually got a very nice day today, despite the howling wind, there's a lot of rainfall in the West Riding, and that all sort of percolates in the rock. And when you start sinking a shaft, you're going to break through all the sort of fissures in the rock and so on. So all of that water is going to be going into the easiest place that it can get to, which is actually this hole behind us. So they were faced with this issue not only at this shaft but also at the other shafts. Interestingly, there's mention of a coal mine as well, and in fact the whole area is littered with old coal mines, and that's really where the raw materials came from for the early industries in this particular area. When those started to be exhausted, the challenge was to get that coal from Halifax or from Bradford up the hillside. That was very, very expensive, and that was the main reason for promoting the railways in this particular area, the transport of raw materials and goods.
So we tend to think of railways as being sort of passenger focused, but actually in the 1870s very often passengers took a back seat.
Well, the passenger element was really initiated by the Act of Parliament for the railway, that the carriage of passengers was a necessity. But the railways were originally promoted by the mill owners and the industrialists of the area, and really the key focus there was on getting their goods to market and getting raw materials in and resources.
Passing the lookout station, from which a view can be had of the line for a considerable distance in both directions, we come to the engine shed, where we found some repairs being done to the locomotive, found so useful on top of the hill. That lookout station was actually an observatory used for surveying purposes, which is where the new house is today. Somewhere here was that engine shed, and over here behind that bush is where shaft number 3 was. So what we're getting is a picture not just of a lot of activity below ground in the tunnel itself, but actually a huge amount of industry on the surface too.
Absolutely. I think with the workings going on at each of the shaft locations, then we've got a lot of activity on the surface here. We've obviously got the temporary railway. The steam locomotive was shedded here for that temporary railway over the top of Queensbury. We've got the materials coming backwards and forwards. We've got the activity at the shaft here with a portable steam locomotive there with doing the winding, the shaft headstock, all of the offices and shanties and whatever else the navvies had here. So yeah, in all respects, a very busy environment here at the top of the hill.
And we discovered that having gone to the effort of sinking that shaft, which is one of the deepest, they actually didn't work it for a period of time because there was so much water descending into it, they had to wait for the heading from number 2 shaft to approach, break through and release that water, drain it out towards Halifax.
That's it. I think that's a continual challenge that we hear about of the sinking of the shafts, is the amount of water that they had to deal with. And in some cases you just can't overcome that. You've got to try and find another way to drain that water. So hence the situation here. They waited until the heading had reached this location and the waters were able to drain off towards Halifax.
It must have been a pretty miserable existence at the bottom of them.
I would think so, and bear in mind now that we use lighting and everything else like that in dark places, these guys would have been using candles and maybe some rudimentary lamps there with torrents of water coming down around them.
After passing a powder magazine, number 4 shaft was reached, where a number of men were actively employed in raising large skeps of earth, etc., from the tunnel. Shaft 4 was effectively the last of the shafts to be worked substantively. Between here and shaft 8, which is near the north end of the tunnel, there was so much water that the 2 intermediate shafts had to be abandoned, so they end up with a 1,200 yard section into which there is no access. But riding to the rescue is Major Beaumont and his rock drilling machine.
Indeed, I think the challenge the contractors had was they planned on completing the tunnel in a space of 2 years. I mean, they were well over that period of time. The tunnel was still incomplete and they had to find a way to very quickly drive that heading through. So Major Beaumont from the Royal Engineers had been working on rock drilling equipment, and he brought his equipment here, and that helped to facilitate the driving of that heading. I think they speeded up the rate 4 or 5-fold.
Indeed. What we have is a newspaper article from October 1877 which says that the bottom heading coming from number 4 shaft, driven by a patent drill machine and gang of Welsh miners, met the heading from the open end of the tunnel at Hull Bottom. That effectively created a pilot tunnel all the way through. The event was announced by a prolonged whistle on the powerful burner. In the morning, flags were flying from the headgear and everyone seemed to know that a road through Queensbury Hill had at last been made. So he really made the difference.
Absolutely, and he went on to drive the headings for some of the other tunnels on the line to Keighley.
While we're here, we ought to mention Henry Ingham, 37-year-old, who was working in a tub near the bottom of the shaft and fell out and ended up drowning in 5 or 6 yards of water. Again, not a pleasant place to be and a very dangerous place to be.
Indeed, as we've said before, a very dangerous working environment around the tunnel.
One of the chief difficulties to be overcome was the large quantities of water that were met with, and in order to get the experienced miners to work, heavy suits of waterproof had to be provided, and each man had to wear a hat very much resembling a sailor's nor'wester. In sinking number 5 shaft, the water accumulated so fast that when the depth of 270 feet had been reached, the men could no longer work and the shaft had to be abandoned. That abandonment happened in December 1875, and in the months that followed there was some discussion as to whether the water being pumped from the shaft, which is just behind this building, could be used to supply the village of Queensbury. In the end that didn't happen, but the local mill certainly did benefit.
The local mill did make use of the water in this shaft. They had it pumped to their reservoir, and this was the mill Foster's at Queensbury. And the interesting thing there is that Foster's were one of the original promoters of the line, so here they were getting some additional benefit from Queensbury Tunnel.
Only a short distance from the line are several blocks of cottages erected by the contractors for their workmen. No one should be favourably impressed with the character of the inmates of these houses, judging from the appearance of their abodes. We hear from the Halifax Courier that there were 14 horses and 600 men, including 200 miners, involved in construction of Queensbury Tunnel, and a lot of them were accommodated in 44 terrace houses which were built where these new buildings are behind us. They weren't very imaginative when it came to naming the streets. There was Great Street, Northern Street and Railway Street. The navvies must have had quite a significant impact on what was otherwise a very small, quiet community.
Yeah, I think with 600 additional people living here, working here, we see Queensbury today as being quite a populous environment. There's a lot of housing these days, but back in the time when the tunnel was being constructed, then there were very few people living in Queensbury.
The railway company clearly had some esteem for those navvies, because when we get to July 1878, work on the tunnel has finished. They put on a huge dinner for them.
That's right, and in order to gain admittance to this dinner, the navvies were all issued with a token, and I just happen to have one of these to hand here, so you can see it's about the size of an old penny. On one side it says dinner only, and on the other side it says the opening of Queensbury Tunnel, July 1878. So this gave you entrance to a slap-up meal in celebration of the opening of the tunnel.
It's a wonderful piece of history you've got there. Let's go through the menu, shall we? 400 pounds of beef, 65 pounds of mutton with tongues, veal, hams, etc. in proportion, together with 27 stone of vegetables. I suspect the navvies had never eaten so well.
I think they had a whale of a time. Sounded like a good slap-up meal.
Top of the hill, some extensive stone quarries are in full operation, good flag rock being quarried. This stone is sent to all parts of the country, a large quantity being conveyed to Homefield Station and then forwarded by rail to its destination. What we've not done so far, and we must, is talk about the number of shafts that were sunk. We know originally they planned 8, but in actual fact they only started work on 7.
That's right. We've got some evidence in the form of a permanent section that was used by the engineers. They'd marked on the original 8 shafts on that permanent section. However, what we also see on that permanent section is that there are only 7 where they've marked on rates of progress, and these are at different positions. So what they've probably done is decided that they could get away with 7 shafts, probably from an expediency perspective, saving some money there, and I'm afraid to say that only 7 shafts were actually driven, including the one that's behind us.
Yes, somebody has a garden feature now, which is another abandoned shaft, again, the amount of water ingress causing huge problems.
Yeah, the issue here was really the quarry behind. A lot of surface water was going through that made-up ground and affecting the workings here. And the problem manifested itself fairly early on. So what they did was they drove a 4-foot square adit from the shaft through the hillside and it merged out into the open there to drain that water coming through. Now that was a short-term measure, because in the end there was so much water coming in that they were forced to abandon this shaft.
There's been rumour of an 8th shaft. Indeed, the railway authorities over the years have spent a lot of time looking for that other shaft. Do you have any sympathy with that?
Personally, I think there's only the 7. I don't think there's a mystery shaft somewhere here. I think we've got enough evidence there that suggests that only 7 were sunk, 2 of which were abandoned. I think they're wasting the time if they're looking for a mysterious hidden shaft here in Queensbury.
I suspect you're right, but it pains me to say it. From the top to the bottom of this hill, the contractors had a tramway and a stationary engine, as at Netherton, and 2 cottages had to be pulled down to make way for this temporary line. So we find ourselves towards the north end of the tunnel with a fabulous view out towards Bradford. The portal is a few hundred yards in that direction. Again, it would have been connected to all the other shafts by means of a tramway, but we think that this tramway was slightly different to the remainder.
Yeah, I think what we've seen in newspaper articles of the day suggests that this may in fact have been a self-acting incline on this side of the hill. Now what that means is that the contractors used the weight of loaded wagons to pull empty wagons up the hill. The two sets being connected by a wire rope around a pulley at the top, although elsewhere we see reference to locomotive engines being used.
No doubt it's a very efficient system, but it doesn't seem to be any safer. We have a report in July 1876 of 16 men basically hitching a ride, I guess, up the hill from Hole Bottom, which is where the north end of the tunnel is, in a wagon. The wagon hits the locomotive engine that was being used to haul it up and manages to disconnect the wire rope, and as a result gravity has a very obvious effect and it hurtles towards the bottom and they have to jump out.
I think they would have had to jump out very, very quickly, because I think the nature of the gradient here, that wagon would have run away very, very quickly. So the sooner they could get out of that wagon, the better to save their lives.
Near the mouth of the tunnel is the engine that has been used for compressing air into the tunnel before a communication was made right through. There is also a blacksmith shop with the innumerable pieces of iron and chains scattered about, the carpenter's shop, the engine house, mortar mill, sawmill, powder magazine. Also on the embankment are several offices, including those of the contractors, Messrs Benton and Woodywis. So, our first sight of the tunnel, having walked all that way, and one thing you notice is just how significant an excavation we are in, and this was all hewn out by human beings.
It was, I think, as we've described before, there wasn't a lot of machinery that was being used in this vast undertaking. And we just have a very deep cutting here with very steep sides on the approach to the tunnel.
And the stonework we see behind us that forms the portal, that would have been effectively recycled from the cutting excavation.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the unique things here, is that the contractors made use of the materials that they had at hand. Obviously with the brick lining, the bricks were made elsewhere, but a portion of the tunnel here is lined in stone, and that stone would have been quarried here locally as part of the excavations for the railway.
As we stand here, one thing that sort of breaks the silence is the cascading water down the shaft and indeed through the lining. It sort of helps you to understand the kind of conditions that people were working in.
I think you're absolutely right there. Not only was it dark, but the incessant water that was coming through, especially at the shafts, and I think the water you referred to there is actually coming down shaft 8, the closest one to where we are. But there is water percolating through the lining in certain places. Other parts it's dry. However, it is a dark place, and if you imagine the navvies and the contractors working in there, they would have had very rudimentary lighting, candles. I mean, our intrepid reporter managed to get through with 2 candles.
Yes, very kindly navvies donated them.
Yes, what possessed him to actually undertake this journey with no form of lighting, and having borrowed a candle from a navvy as he entered the tunnel, and then a second one when the first one had expired.
I'm very glad he did, because he paints a unique picture, doesn't he?
It is, and I think it's quite unique that we've got this account. There's no photographs, obviously, to accompany that article, but there is a lot of words there, and he describes the progress of the works in some great detail. And because the tunnel is in various stages of construction, in some cases we've only got the heading, in other cases we've got the full extent of the tunnel has been lined, we get a good understanding of what it was like to work in that environment.
A great change has taken place in the aspect of the deep hollow beneath Queensbury, suitably named Hole Bottom. Before these works commenced, cattle grazed in the pasture land below, and the only feature to relieve the quiet of the pastoral scene was a tramway up the hillside, connecting the coal pit of Mr. Briggs at the bottom with the landing place at the top.
We find ourselves, finally, as hypothermia begins to set in, and it is, on the site of Queensbury's former station. Just behind us is where the Halifax to Keighley platform would have been. How much of an impact did the arrival of the railway have on the people hereabouts?
Well, I think it was quite a significant impact, because for the first time the local inhabitants could catch a train to other destinations. So whether they wanted to go to Bradford, Halifax, Keighley when the extension was opened, or other places in between, for the first time they were able to get on a train and get to that destination a lot easier.
Did it work as a goods route, as a freight route?
It did work as a freight route, and one of the key elements in the original schemes for promotion was to establish a north and south route. And in fact, once the extension to Keighley was open, then that was provided for in those days. I mean, certainly there was a lot of freight being worked to Clayton, to Thornton, on to Keighley, and so on.
So the tunnel we've been discussing was actually quite busy in terms of traffic.
It was, not only passenger traffic, freight traffic, but also excursion traffic as well.
Why should this tunnel not simply be filled with concrete and forgotten about?
Well, I think it's a unique example of Victorian engineering on the one hand. To simply bury that without a trace, I think that has to be the wrong thing. I think we want to celebrate what the Victorians achieved, and this is one of their great achievements. The other aspect is, having been involved as one of the promoters of the Great Northern Railway Trail, and we've got a number of sections of that already open, this would be a fantastic asset to have as part of linking that trail with Halifax, using the old tunnel as a cycle and throughway.
Nobody's suggesting that taxpayers' money should be pumped into this tunnel rather than schools or hospitals. That would be bonkers. But there is a fair chance that several £1 million will be spent in here in order to make it structurally sound. Wouldn't it make sense then if the public got something back for that investment? This tunnel is just a liability, if you choose to see it that way. But with some vision, it could join the dozens of other former railway structures to find function again as part of our growing cycle network. If you're not convinced by its history or its magnitude or its engineering, just look at the bottom line. Filling and burying this tunnel offers no value for money as far as the public purse is concerned. Keeping it open would benefit both the local community and the wider Yorkshire region. Common sense says it has to be worth saving.